Determined to end it all, a millionaire stares into the void below the bridge until he notices a little girl about to jump. Without thinking, he runs to hold her back, but what happens next spirals beyond his control. In trying to help her, he finds himself caught in a drama even greater than his own. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our moving stories. Continuing. The biting January wind lashed against Richard Mendoza's face as he stared at the dark waters of the East River below the majestic Brooklyn Bridge. New York City, a metropolis that never sleeps, maintained its frantic rhythm even at this hour of the night. Car lights formed an endless procession, but Richard was oblivious to it all. For him, the world had lost its luster exactly 3 years ago. "I should be with you," he murmured into the void, his hands tightening on the bridge railing. At 45, Richard was what many would call a success story. Owner of Mendoza Developments, one of the largest construction companies in the country, he had an estimated net worth in the billions. His face occasionally graced business magazines, always with the serious, determined expression that characterized him. But tonight there was nothing left of the ruthless businessman everyone knew. There was only a broken man, consumed by guilt. The accident had happened on a rainy night. After a heated argument with Helen, his wife, Richard had drunk too much at a business dinner. He insisted on driving home, ignoring his colleagues' pleas. Helen, concerned, went to pick him up along with Lauren, their 10-year-old daughter. What should have been an act of love turned into tragedy when a truck collided with the family car on Interstate 95. Richard survived with minor injuries. Helen and Lauren weren't so lucky. "It was my fault," he repeated like a mantra. "It will always be my fault." 3 years had passed, but the pain remained as alive as on the first day. Richard had buried himself in work, medications, and eventually in the alcohol he once hated. His social life was reduced to business meetings. His mansion on the Upper East Side, once filled with laughter, now echoed only with silence and memories. On this particular night, after an especially intense breakdown, Richard made a decision. He couldn't bear the weight of that guilt anymore. He drove to the Brooklyn Bridge, parked his luxury car in a restricted area, and walked to the highest point. He was certain nobody would miss him. His parents had passed years ago, he had no siblings, and his friends had gradually distanced themselves, unable to deal with his bitterness. That's when he saw a small silhouette moving in the shadows, near the edge of the bridge. Richard squinted, trying to see better. A child? Impossible. But as he approached, he confirmed. It was a girl, couldn't be more than 9 years old, wearing tattered, faded clothes. She was sitting dangerously on the edge, her legs dangling over the abyss. "Hey!" Richard shouted, momentarily forgetting his own plans. "What are you doing there? It's dangerous." The girl turned abruptly, startled by the shout. The sudden movement caused her to lose balance. A scream of terror escaped her throat as her small body tilted backward toward the void. Richard acted on instinct. In 3 long strides, he reached the girl and grabbed her thin arm firmly, pulling her back to safety. Both fell sitting on the cold bridge floor, breathless. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard shouted, his heart still racing. "You could have fallen." The girl stared at him with enormous, frightened, honey-colored eyes. There was something in that look, a mixture of fear and defiance that completely disarmed him. "You were going to jump," she said. Not as a question, but as a statement. "I saw you." Richard felt his face heat up. "Don't be absurd, I was just observing the view." "Liar," she retorted, rubbing her arm where he had grabbed her. "Nobody comes here at this hour just to see the view." There was a wisdom in her. Eyes that didn't match her age. A wisdom acquired at the cost of harsh experiences, Richard suspected. "What's your name?" he asked, softening his tone. "Sophie," she replied after a few seconds of hesitation. "Sophie Allen." "And what are you doing here alone at this hour, Sophie Allen?" The girl shrugged, a gesture that seemed loaded with meanings she didn't want to express in words. "Sometimes I come here to think. My dad is sick, very sick." Her voice faltered a little. "He can't work anymore." Richard felt a pang of compassion, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. "And where do you live?" "Under the Queens Expressway overpass," she answered. naturally as if it were perfectly normal for a child to live on the street. But it won't be like this forever. Dad will get better and we'll have a real home. The conviction with which she spoke made Richard feel a mixture of admiration and sadness. This girl, living in conditions he could barely imagine, still managed to maintain hope. "You shouldn't be walking alone at night in the city. It's dangerous," he warned. "You shouldn't be thinking about jumping off the bridge," she responded perceptively. "And yet here we are." Richard couldn't suppress a slight smile at the girl's audacity. "Touché. You're smart for your age." "I'm 9, but Dad says I have an old soul." A silence settled between them. Richard looked at his watch. It was past midnight. "You need to go home, Sophie. Your father must be worried." A shadow passed over the girl's face. "He won't notice. He took his medicine and sleeps through the night." Richard hesitated. Part of him, the rational, pragmatic part, told him to walk away. He had enough problems already. He couldn't get involved with the problems of a homeless child, but there was something about this girl that prevented him from simply turning his back. "Come on, I'll give you a ride," he offered, surprising himself. Sophie studied him suspiciously. "My dad taught me not to accept rides from strangers." "Your dad is right," Richard agreed, "but think about it. If I wanted to harm you, why would I have stopped you from falling?" The logic seemed to convince the girl. With a resigned sigh, she stood up and followed him to the parked car. On the way to the overpass, Richard tried to extract more information about Sophie's situation and her father, but she retreated into a stubborn silence. Only when they arrived, near the location she had indicated, did she speak again. "You can stop here. I don't want anyone seeing this fancy car." Richard obeyed. He parked the vehicle at a safe distance and watched as Sophie jumped out. "Thanks for the ride," she said. Then, after a brief hesitation, she added, "And for not letting me fall." Before Richard could respond, she disappeared into the shadows. On four. The way back home, Richard couldn't get the image of that girl out of his head. It was as if fate had played a trick on him. Just when he'd decided to give up on everything, the universe had placed in his path a child who needed help. Upon arriving at his silent mansion, instead of heading to the bar as he did every night, Richard went to his office. He turned on the computer and began researching homeless residents, social assistance, and procedures for reporting child abuse. Hours passed as he absorbed information, taking notes, making plans. When the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate through the blinds, Richard realized with astonishment that for the first time in 3 years, he had spent an entire night without thinking about joining Helen and Lauren. Instead, his thoughts were occupied with a honey-eyed girl with an old soul who lived under an overpass and still managed to maintain hope. That morning, looking in the mirror, Richard saw something different in his own eyes, a faint gleam that had long disappeared. He wasn't exactly sure what to do next, but he was certain of one thing: he needed to see Sophie again. The morning after the bridge encounter, Richard awoke with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He cancelled all of his meetings for the day, something unthinkable for the workaholic he had become, and after a few strategic phone calls, drove to the city centre with a clear mission to find Sophie again. He took with him a bag of food, new clothes, and some children's books he found in Lauren's untouched room. Each object removed from his daughter's old room had been a small battle against the pain, but strangely, he felt that Helen and Lauren would approve. The sun was already high when Richard parked near the Queen's Expressway overpass. Dressed casually, jeans and a t-shirt, something rare in his wardrobe full of expensive suits, he hoped to go unnoticed. Still, his elegant bearing and luxury vehicle attracted suspicious glances from the residents of that makeshift community. "I'm looking for Sophie Allen and her father," he explained to a group of people who were watching him suspiciously. "Do you know them?" An elderly woman wrapped in a faded shawl pointed to a more secluded corner under the shadow of the overpass. "Those two over there. August is in bad shape. The girl doesn't leave his side." Richard thanked her and walked in. The indicated direction. The smell of dampness and despair grew stronger with each step. How could a child live in such conditions? He found Sophie sitting next to a man who was far too thin, far too pale, lying on some tattered blankets. She was holding a damp cloth to her father's forehead and softly humming a lullaby. The scene was one of tenderness that contrasted brutally with the misery around them. "Sophie?" he called softly. The girl raised her eyes, first frightened, then surprised to recognize him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, suspicious. Richard raised the bag in response. "I brought some things I thought they might be useful." Sophie frowned, visibly torn between need and pride. August coughed violently, drawing the attention of both. His eyes opened, feverish and confused. "Who are you?" he asked in a weak voice, trying to sit up. "Easy, Dad," Sophie pleaded, gently pushing him back onto the blankets. "This is a friend. He helped me last night." Richard introduced himself, extending a hand that August was too weak to shake. "Your daughter is an extraordinary girl," he commented. "I met her yesterday by chance." "Sophie is my treasure," August murmured, with a look of adoration for his daughter. "My only treasure." The cough attacked him again, stronger this time. Sophie looked at Richard with pleading eyes. "He needs a doctor. He's getting worse." Richard didn't hesitate. In minutes he had convinced August to let him take him to the hospital. The man weighed so little that Richard was able to carry him alone to the car, while Sophie quickly gathered the few belongings they had. At New York Presbyterian Hospital, Richard's money and influence ensured immediate attention. August was diagnosed with advanced pneumonia, complicated by severe malnutrition and untreated diabetes. The doctor was frank. Without adequate treatment, the condition could rapidly worsen. "Will he be okay?" Sophie asked, clutching Richard's hand as they watched August being taken to a room. "We'll do everything possible," Richard promised, surprised by the sincerity of his own words. In the days that followed, Richard divided his time between the hospital and the office. He arranged for Sophie to stay at a nearby hotel, under the care of Mrs. Celeste, the housekeeper from his mansion, who accepted the unusual task without question. At first, Sophie resisted all attempts to help. Suspicious, she constantly questioned Richard's intentions. "Why are you doing all this for us?" she asked one afternoon as they walked down the hospital corridor after visiting August. Richard stopped, reflecting. Why indeed? Even he didn't know how to fully explain it. "Maybe because by helping you, I'm trying to help myself too," he finally answered. Sophie studied him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see beyond words. "You seem sad, even when you smile." "I lost people I loved very much," Richard admitted, surprised at how easily he opened up to this child. "My wife and my daughter. She would be about your age now." Sophie was silent for a few moments, processing the information. "I'm sorry," she said finally, taking Richard's hand with her small fingers. It was such a natural, comforting gesture that he felt a lump in his throat. Day by day, as August fought against the illness in the hospital, an unlikely bond began to form between Richard and Sophie. He took her to places she had never seen before: Central Park, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art. He bought her new clothes, books, and even a cell phone so they could communicate. He temporarily enrolled her in a private school near the hotel, arguing that she needed to occupy her time while her father recovered. Sophie, in turn, brought something back to Richard's life that he thought was forever lost: lightness. Her insatiable curiosity, her frank way of seeing the world, and even her occasional stubbornness made him smile genuinely for the first time in years. But not everything was rosy. As days turned into weeks, Richard began to notice disturbing patterns. Sophie rarely talked about her life before the overpass. When the subject came up, she would change the conversation or retreat into a stubborn silence. And more alarmingly, whenever she mentioned her father, there was an almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. One night, as they were having dinner at the hotel, Richard decided to approach the subject carefully. "Sophie, if there's anything bothering you, anything about your father or about the past, you can tell me. I'd like to help." The girl put down her fork, suddenly tense. "There's nothing to tell, we're fine, or we will be when Dad gets better." But her eyes told a different story. Richard noticed a shadow of fear that the girl was trying to hide. "Sophie, trust me. If someone hurt you—" "No," she exclaimed, rising abruptly. "Dad would never hurt me, never." The vehemence of her denial only increased Richard's suspicions. During his research on assistance for children at risk, he had learned that victims of abuse often protected their abusers, especially when they were parental figures. "It's okay," he calmed her, temporarily backing off. "I just want you to know that I'm here to listen when you're ready." In the days that followed, Richard discreetly hired a private investigator to find out more about August and Sophie's past. The investigation revealed a disturbing picture. Before living on the streets, they had lived in a small town in upstate New York. August had worked as a mechanic until he was fired due to problems with alcohol. Sophie's mother, Lucy, had abandoned the family when the girl was only 5, apparently after several episodes of domestic violence. Sophie's school records showed a brilliant child, but with irregular attendance and signs of possible neglect. There was also a report to Child Protective Services made by a teacher, but it was never properly investigated. Armed with this information, Richard faced a profound ethical dilemma. August was slowly recovering. In a few weeks, he would be discharged. What would happen to Sophie then? Would they return to the streets, to a potentially abusive situation? Richard consulted lawyers who specialized in family law. The options were limited. He could report August to the authorities, which would probably result in the separation of father and daughter, with Sophie being sent to a foster home. Or he could offer financial help and try to monitor the situation from a distance, with no guarantees that Sophie would truly be safe. Neither alternative seemed ideal. It was during a visit to the hospital, watching Sophie read aloud to her father, that a third possibility arose in Richard's mind. A bold idea, perhaps insane, but one he couldn't dismiss. On the way out, while Sophie was saying goodbye to her father, Richard approached August's bed. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "about Sophie's future." August looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and distrust. "What do you mean?" "I want to propose an arrangement," Richard explained, "something that would benefit all of us, especially Sophie." Before he could continue, Sophie returned to join them. Richard saved the rest of the conversation for another time, but the seed had been planted. That night, lying in his king-size bed in the silent Upper East Side mansion, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The pain of losing Helen and Lauren was still there, a wound that would probably never completely heal. But now there was something else, a purpose, a reason to get up every morning that went beyond the mere obligation to exist. He thought about Sophie, with her resilience and intelligence, about how she deserved much more than fate had given her so far, about how perhaps he could be the instrument of that change. The next day, Richard scheduled a meeting with his lawyer to discuss the legal requirements for becoming the temporary guardian of a minor. It was a complex path, full of obstacles, but he was determined to pursue it. What Richard didn't know was that, while he was making his plans, powerful forces were moving in the shadows. Sophie and August's past held secrets much deeper than he could imagine, and soon, these revelations would threaten to destroy the fragile happiness they were building. 4 months had passed since the fateful night on the Brooklyn Bridge. New York's fall brought a pleasant breeze that tempered the persistent heat, while the leaves on the trees in Central Park began to change color. It was against this backdrop that Richard and Sophie walked side by side, sharing an ice cream and talking about the day at school. "I got an A in math," Sophie announced proudly, licking a drop of chocolate that dripped down the cone. "I'm not surprised," Richard smiled. "You're brilliant." The transformation was remarkable. Sophie was no longer the suspicious, ragged girl who lived under an overpass. Now she attended one of the best schools in New York, dressed well, and her honey-colored eyes shone with renewed vivacity. As for Richard, those who had known him before would hardly recognize him. The deep eye bags had disappeared, as had the perpetually melancholic air. He remained serious and reserved, but there was a softness to his gestures, a patience that hadn't existed before. August Allen had been discharged from the hospital 3 months ago. Following the arrangement proposed by Richard, he had moved into a small apartment in Astoria, Queens, bought and furnished by Richard. Sophie spent weekends with her father, but during the week she lived in the Upper East Side mansion, where she received guidance from private tutors to compensate for the years of lost education. The agreement seemed to work well. August, now sober and with his health recovered, worked at a mechanic's shop recommended by Richard. Sophie flourished academically and was slowly beginning to overcome some of the traumas of the past. And Richard had found a new purpose, dedicating himself to creating a safe and stimulating environment for the girl. However, beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, tensions were accumulating. Richard had discovered, through careful conversations with Sophie and discreet reports from a social worker he had hired, that August had indeed been neglectful and occasionally violent with his daughter. The episodes normally occurred when he was drunk, but that didn't diminish the gravity of the problem. Sophie, however, maintained a fierce loyalty to her father, minimizing the incidents and insisting that he didn't mean to. The ethical dilemma that Richard faced was complex. Reporting August could traumatize Sophie even more, as well as send her into the foster care system, where there would be no guarantees of a loving home. On the other hand, allowing the current arrangement to continue meant putting her in regular contact with someone who could potentially hurt her again. It was during one of these reflections, sitting in his home office, that Richard was interrupted by Marcy, his secretary. "Mr. Mendoza, there's a man insisting on seeing you. He says it's urgent and related to Sophie. She hesitated. He seems very influential. He brought security guards and a lawyer." Richard frowned. "What's his name?" "Edward Vieira." Richard's blood ran cold. Edward Vieira was one of the most powerful businessmen in the United States, owner of a luxury hotel chain and a constant figure in the society columns. The two knew each other superficially from the business circuit, but had never been close. What could he want with Sophie? Send him in, Richard decided, tense. Edward Vieira entered the office with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. Tall, elegantly dressed, with perfectly trimmed grey hair, he conveyed an aura of power and authority. Without waiting for an invitation, he sat in the chair opposite Richard's desk. "Mendoza, let's get straight to the point," he began, dispensing with any formality. "I know you're sheltering Sophie Allen. What you may not know is that she is my biological daughter, and I've come to get her." The words hit Richard like a punch. "Sophie, Edward Vieira's daughter, how is that possible?" "That's absurd," Richard retorted, recovering from the initial shock. "Sophie is August Allen's daughter. I have all the documents that prove it." Edward smiled condescendingly. "Documents lie. Lucy, Sophie's mother, worked as a receptionist at one of my hotels 10 years ago. We had an involvement. When she got pregnant, I offered financial support, but she preferred to return to her husband, making him believe the child was his." He paused theatrically. "I have DNA tests that prove what I'm saying." Richard struggled to process the information. If Edward was telling the truth, it changed everything. But why appear now after so many years? "If Sophie is really your daughter, why did you wait so long to look for her?" he questioned, his voice laden with skepticism. Edward's smile faltered slightly. "Lucy made me promise not to interfere. I respected that wish until recently, when I learned that Sophie was living on the streets." His tone hardened. "I will not allow my daughter to live like a beggar or be raised by strangers, no matter how well-intentioned they may be." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Sophie entered, still wearing her school uniform, her face lighting up upon seeing Richard. Then she noticed the presence of the stranger and stopped, hesitant. "Sophie, dear," Richard called, trying to keep his voice calm. "This is Mr. Vieira. He came to talk about some important matters." Edward stood up, looking at Sophie with a mixture of fascination and contained emotion. "Hello, Sophie. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." The girl moved instinctively, closer to Richard, wary of the intensity in the stranger's gaze. "Hi," she responded simply, her hand seeking Richard's. "Sophie, why don't you go do your homework?" Richard suggested gently. "We need to talk about adult matters here." After the girl's reluctant exit, the atmosphere in the office became even tenser. Edward exposed his intentions without beating around the bush. He would file for custody of Sophie based on the biological connection and his ability to offer a privileged life. He mentioned schools in Switzerland, international trips, opportunities that Richard, despite his fortune, could never provide. "She will have the best that money can buy," Edward assured, "and most importantly, she'll be with her real father." Richard felt a growing anger. Being a father goes far beyond sharing DNA, Vera. Sophie has gone through traumas that you can't even imagine. She's finally adapting, feeling safe. Tearing that away from her now would be cruel. "Don't be hypocritical, Mendoza," Edward retorted coldly. "We all know why you've become so attached to this girl. She's a substitute for your lost daughter. You're using Sophie to fill a void in your life, not for her own good." The words hit Richard like a knife. There was an element of truth in them that he couldn't completely deny. Initially, Sophie had indeed attracted him because she resembled Lauren in some ways, but what had begun as an attempt at redemption had transformed into something genuine. He loved Sophie for who she was, not for what she represented. "I don't intend to discuss my motivations with you," Richard responded, controlling his anger. "What matters is Sophie's well-being, and tearing a child from the environment where she finally feels safe to satisfy your sudden desire for fatherhood is definitely not best for her." Edward stood up, adjusting his impeccable suit jacket. "My lawyers will be in touch. I suggest you prepare Sophie for the transition. The smoother it is, the less traumatic it will be for everyone." He walked to the door and added, "You don't stand a chance against me, Mendoza. I have influence and unlimited resources, and most importantly, I have biology on my side." After Edward's departure, Richard remained motionless for long minutes, trying to organize his thoughts. The threat was real. Edward Vieira was not the type of man who bluffed, and his resources were indeed formidable. If the DNA test confirmed paternity, Richard's chances in court would be minimal. In the days that followed, a legal and emotional battle unfolded. Edward, as promised, filed for custody, presenting the DNA test that confirmed he was Sophie's biological father. The judge determined that while the case was pending, Sophie would remain under Richard's care with supervised visits to Edward. The first meeting between Sophie and her supposed biological father was tense. The girl, initially cold and distant, gradually opened up when Edward mentioned her mother, Lucy. Sophie had few memories of her mother, who had left when she was only 5, but the memories she did have were positive. Edward spoke about Lucy with affection and respect, which clearly touched the girl. "She was strong and determined like you," Edward told her, "and she had the same expressive eyes." Sophie, always eager for information about the mother that August refused to discuss, drank in every word. At the end of the meeting, when the social worker asked how Sophie felt, the response was ambivalent. "He seems nice, but he's not my dad. My dad is August, and Richard is also like a father to me." The girl's divided loyalty became increasingly evident as the weeks passed. Edward, acting in a calculated manner, showered Sophie with gifts, promised trips and extraordinary experiences. August, meanwhile, reacted to the situation unexpectedly. He stopped drinking completely, got a better job, and began attending therapy sessions, determined to prove he could be a good father. Richard observed everything with growing apprehension. He knew his chances in court were slim. On paper, he was just a stranger who had temporarily sheltered Sophie. He had no blood ties, no previous history with the girl. His past with alcoholism after the family tragedy would be easily exploited by Edward's lawyers to question his capacity as a guardian. It was Marcy, his longtime secretary, who offered a crucial clue. "Sir, there's a woman who wants to speak with you about Sophie's case. She said she has important information about Edward Vieira. She seems nervous and insisted she couldn't give her name over the phone." The woman introduced herself as Christine Vasquez, Edward Vieira's former personal assistant. She brought with her a folder of documents and a frightened look. "What I'm doing could cost me dearly," she explained, her voice trembling. "But I can't stay silent knowing that a child might be handed over to that man." The documents that Christine brought painted a disturbing portrait of Edward Vieira. Behind the facade of a respectable businessman and philanthropist, there was a calculating man without scruples. Among the papers were evidence of payments to witnesses in previous lawsuits, records of supposed accidents that happened to people who had crossed him, and, most alarmingly, indications that Edward was involved in the disappearance of Lucy, Sophie's mother. Lucy discovered some shady business dealings of Edward's and threatened to expose him, Christine explained. She also threatened to reveal that Sophie was his daughter, something he wanted to keep secret at the time. Shortly after, she decided to abandon her family. I never believed that. Richard stared at the documents, feeling a mixture of horror and hope. If what Christine was saying was true, perhaps there was a chance to prevent Sophie from being handed over to Edward, but it also meant putting the girl and everyone around her at risk. "Why does Edward want Sophie now?" Richard asked, trying to understand the businessman's motivation. Christine hesitated. "Edward has terminal cancer. The doctors have given him less than a year. He's putting his affairs in order, and that includes securing his lineage. Sophie is his only biological descendant." The revelation further complicated the situation. A judge would certainly consider the desire of a dying man to know his biological daughter. Richard was pondering his options when the doorbell rang. In the entrance hall, accompanied by a social worker, was a woman of about 40, thin, with evident marks of a difficult life, but still beautiful. Her honey-colored eyes, like Sophie's, left no doubt about her identity. "I'm Lucy Allen," she announced with a firm voice. "I've come for my daughter." Lucy's reappearance caused an earthquake in the case. She brought with her documents proving that she had not abandoned Sophie voluntarily, but had fled after being threatened by Edward. According to her account, she had lived in hiding for years, working under a false name in small towns, until she recently learned through news reports about the custody battle for Sophie. "Edward doesn't want Sophie because he loves her," Lucy stated during a tense hearing in court. "He wants her as a trophy, as another possession, and he knows she's the only person who can inherit his fortune." Edward, confronted with the accusations and evidence, reacted with barely contained fury. He denied everything, accused Lucy of abandonment and lies, and cast doubt on the authenticity of the documents presented. The judge, faced with the impasse, determined that Sophie would temporarily remain under Richard's guardianship, while ordering an in-depth investigation into the allegations against Edward. The real shock, however, came when Sophie finally met Lucy. The girl who had dreamed for years of her mother's return showed herself to be surprisingly cold and distant. "You left me," she accused, her eyes moist. "If you were in danger, why didn't you take me with you?" Lucy, devastated, tried to explain that leaving her with August had been the safest choice at the time, that she had planned to return as soon as she established a stable life away from Edward's reach. But to a child who had lived for years, feeling abandoned, the explanations sounded like empty excuses. The case now involved 4 adults claiming some kind of right over Sophie: Edward as the biological father, August as the legal father, Lucy as the biological and legal mother, and Richard as the man who had effectively cared for her in recent months and created deep emotional bonds. At the epicenter of this emotional and legal hurricane was Sophie, increasingly confused and withdrawn. Her therapist warned that the girl was beginning to show signs of depression and anxiety, a direct consequence of the instability and pressures. It was during a particularly difficult session in the judge's chambers, with all parties present, that Sophie finally exploded. "Stop! All of you," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You're talking about me as if I were a thing, not a person. Nobody asks me what I want." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge, an elderly man with decades of experience in family cases, looked directly at Sophie. "You're right, and I apologize for that. What do you want, Sophie?" The girl took a deep breath, looking at each of the adults who were vying for her custody. "I want to stay with Richard," she finally said, with surprising conviction for someone so young. "He never lied to me, never abandoned me, and never hurt me. He really listens to me, not just pretends to listen." The words fell like bombs in the room. Edward went pale, Lucy choked back a sob, and August lowered his head, visibly ashamed. Richard, for his part, felt a wave of emotion so intense that he was momentarily speechless. The judge, sensitive to the sincerity of Sophie's declaration, scheduled a final hearing for the following week, where a decision would be made considering, above all, the wish expressed by the girl herself. The night before the decisive hearing, Richard found Sophie sitting on the terrace of the mansion looking at the stars. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, sitting beside her. "A little," Sophie admitted, "but I know what I want to tell the judge." Richard smiled, touched by the girl's determination. "You know, Sophie, regardless of what happens tomorrow, you will always have a place here with me. Even if the judge decides you should live with your mother or with Edward, this will always be your home too." Sophie turned to him, her eyes reflecting the soft moonlight. "Why did you do all this for me?" she asked. The same question she had asked months ago, but now with a deeper understanding. Richard thought for a moment, seeking the most honest answer. In the beginning, maybe it was out of guilt, or wanting to fill the void left by Lauren. But now, his voice faltered slightly, "Now it's because you, Sophie Allen, exactly as you are, brought light back into my life. You taught me that it's possible to love again, even after losing so much." Sophie smiled, an expression of understanding beyond her years passing over her face. She leaned in to hug Richard, a gesture that had become natural between them. "You brought light to me too," she murmured against his shoulder. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. The case had attracted media attention, partly due to the prominence of Edward Vieira and Richard Mendoza in business circles. After hearing the final arguments from all parties, the judge asked to speak with Sophie privately. The conversation lasted almost an hour. When they finally returned to the courtroom, Sophie seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The judge's verdict was surprising, and at the same time deeply human. He recognized the biological rights of Edward and Lucy, as well as August's legal bond, but granted primary custody to Richard, the person Sophie had chosen as her family. "Family is not just blood," the judge declared. "It's love, security, stability. And that's what Sophie found with Richard Mendoza." He also determined that Sophie would have the right to maintain regular contact with August, Lucy, and, if she wished, with Edward, always considering her emotional well-being as the absolute priority. Edward, defeated, left the courtroom without looking back. Lucy, though visibly disappointed, approached Richard and Sophie after the hearing. "Take good care of her," she asked with tears in her eyes, "and allow me to be part of her life, even if from a distance." August, who had remained sober throughout the judicial process, shook Richard's hand firmly. "You gave her what I couldn't," he acknowledged, his voice choked. "But I'm still her father, in my own way." "You always will be," Richard agreed. "And you'll always have a place in her life." 6 months later, the Upper East Side mansion, once cold and silent, overflowed with life. Sophie had transformed the space with her energy and creativity. Her room, decorated according to her own choices, reflected her vibrant personality. The walls that once held only painful memories now displayed new photographs. Sophie on her birthday, Sophie and Richard at the park, Sophie with Lucy during a weekend together, Sophie and August at a football game. Edward Vieira had passed away 2 months after the trial, a victim of the disease that was consuming him. To everyone's surprise, he had left a considerable part of his fortune in a trust fund for Sophie, accessible only when she turned 21, a final gesture that perhaps demonstrated some regret or genuine desire to do something positive for the daughter he never really got to know. On that sunny Sunday afternoon, as Sophie played in the garden with a Labrador puppy that Richard had adopted for her, he watched from the terrace, a long unknown peace filling his chest. Helen and Lauren remained alive in his memory, a sweet pain that would never completely disappear. But now there was also room for new joys, new dreams. "Dad," Sophie called, running toward him with the puppy at her heels. It was the first time she had called him that. and the impact of the word hit him with emotional force. "Come see what Max learned to do." Richard smiled, rising to meet her halfway. Family, as the judge had said, was not just blood. It was choice, commitment, unconditional love. And in Sophie's eyes he saw the reflection of a future that finally seemed bright.